Dr. Tommy Kidd. I'm Senior Fellow at the Institute for Studies of Religion, where I co-direct the program on historical studies of religion. Many of you have been to ISR events before, but for those of you who have not, the Institute for Studies of Religion is an interdisciplinary institute here at Baylor that focuses on a study of all aspects of religion, from history to health and medicine, philosophy, sociology, and obviously, given today's topic, politics too. And we bring in a range of speakers on a host of topics and symposia on religion. And today, I'm very pleased to introduce my friend Mark Tooley. And Mark is the president of the Institute on Religion and Democracy, which is an ecumenical Christian think tank in Washington, D.C. It was founded in 1981 to help reform the political witness of America's churches. And he previously worked for the CIA. Mr. Tooley has written for the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, the Weekly Standard, the American Spectator, First Things, and a number of other publications on the church's political witness, on issues such as national security, Islam, the federal budget, environmentalism, religious liberty, marriage, abortion, and other issues as well. He's the author of books including Methodism Politics in the 20th Century, which came out in 2012, and Taking Back the United Methodist Church in 2008. And he is currently writing a book on religion in Washington, D.C., on the advent of the Civil War. Will you help me and join me in welcoming Mark Tooley?
Well, it's great to be here with you all. And I appreciate Tom's introduction, and I've really enjoyed getting to know Thomas over the last couple of years, and appreciate his wonderful histories and his biography of Patrick Henry, and the fact that ISR apparently is going to be doing more in Washington, D.C., which Washington is always in need of more religious instruction. So that will be a helpful influence, I'm confident. I should also say I came to Texas assuming I would be finding warm, balmy weather down here, and have been very disappointed so far, but that's been the only disappointment. My talk, as you know, is about Christian social and political witness, and how churches and Christians might best address politics and to develop a public theology. And I make some distinction between churches and Christians because the political vocation for the institutional church is somewhat different from that for individual Christians. I think historically the institutional church teaches broad principles, but politically, but its primary vocation, of course, is to proclaim the gospel, to evangelize, to disciple, to offer help to those who are in need materially. But the more specific vocation for the details of politics are primarily left up to the Christian lay people. And sometimes we confuse those vocations, but I think they're important distinctions. We're currently very much, at least in America, at a crossroads in terms of how Christians address politics. The religious right that emerged in the 1970s and certainly had a very influential run across 3 to 4 decades is now ebbing, at least in its old forms, and most of its major notables have either left this world or left active life. The old religious left is also very much at a cul-de-sac and has been there for some time, and no longer commands, if it ever did, command a wide audience. And so we're left in a situation where many Christians have no clear direction in terms of a helpful social and political witness for their faith. And some, especially at this time in America, are very much tempted towards withdrawal, despair, or cynicism about politics, about the culture, and about the nation. But just to cite, and I'm going to speak very broadly and generally in the interest of time, but some of the recent traditions in American Christian social and political witness have been these. I'm not going to talk about a lot regarding Catholic social teaching, which I'm certainly not an expert in. I'm a little bit intimidated by Frank Beckwith's presence up there, the noted Catholic philosopher who could correct almost anything I have to say on this topic. But just briefly, of course, Catholic social teaching dates, as I understand it, mostly from the 19th century. And I think it has not been deeply influential in American culture and politics until Catholics very much came of their own into the mainstream in the mid and latter part of the 20th century. And of course, that became especially vivid in the 1970s after the Supreme Court's abortion rights ruling in 1973, and on many other issues. I'm old enough to remember the Catholic bishop's controversial letter on nuclear weapons, which essentially argued for a replacement of a nuclear deterrence in the early and mid 1980s. And of course, there's also the ongoing theme there of the continuum of life. And some of you, well, probably not many of you, but some of you may recall Chicago Cardinal Bernardine and his, what he phrased, a seamless garment of life, which as it was, whatever his intention was, as it was popularly portrayed, it argued for a continuous opposition to abortion and nuclear weapons and capital punishment and economic injustice. And it was a whole package of issues put together under that continuum of life. And of course, more recently, we've had the American Catholic bishops arguing strongly for a special emphasis on the defense of traditional marriage, the defense of the unborn, and the defense of religious liberty. So that's Catholic social teaching. There's the old-time Protestant social gospel, which has probably been the most pervasive or influential form of Christian social witness in the 20th century. And it correlated, it didn't necessarily completely overlap with, but it correlated with the rise of theological modernism and liberalism, which of course de-emphasized or rejected the core doctrines of the faith in terms of their literal truth, and would argue in favor of their being understood metaphorically, the virgin birth, the bodily resurrection, and so forth, and really reinterpreted the church's mission as being not so much evangelistic or saving souls, but rather to work to create a more just society. And I would date its, not its birth, but its really sort of coming of age to 1908, when actually 1907, a group called the Methodist Federation for Social Service came together and created what they called a social creed, mostly focused on rights for workers, and pulled into their circle the then Vice President of the United States, who was an active Methodist layman, and met with President Teddy Roosevelt, who was very much a progressive Christian and a social reformer, who gave them his blessing, and they got the what was then the largest Protestant denomination in America, the Northern Methodist Church, to endorse this social creed, and operating very quickly. In that same year, 1908, persuaded the Federal Council of Churches to also adopt the social creed, and that really became the battle cry of all of what was then known as mainline Protestantism, and remained so for the next 6-7 decades. It started mostly with that focus on rights for workers, fair wages, opposition to child labor, and so forth. It moved on to, in the wake of World War I, advocating pacifism. It moved on to being very critical of capitalism overall. For example, the Methodist, at least the Northern Methodists in 1932, declared their opposition to what they called the profit motive, which was a euphemism for capitalism, and continued on that trajectory for several decades until it was met with somewhat of a corrective in the form of Reinhold Niebuhr, who's of course the famous theologian, usually called neo-Orthodox, who had been himself a fairly conventional modernist or theological liberal, and remained theologically liberal or modernist, but rejected much of the how the social gospel interpreted the church's mission in society. In that, for example, in the 1930s, he vociferously rejected pacifism and created a magazine called Christianity in Crisis to argue for rallying the democracies against the rise of Nazism and fascism and other dictatorships around the world, and became one of the fathers of what was known as Christian realism. And again, it was very pragmatic. So, for example, although he argued in favor of participation in World War II and the use of armed force in some situations. He was not a believer conventionally in a Christian just war teaching. He, for the most part, rejected that very venerable Christian tradition in the history of the church and created his own new pragmatic reasons as to why force might be justified. But much of his emphasis was on, even though he was a modernist theologically, he certainly was a more traditional and Augustinian in his understanding that humanity is fallen and sinful, and so it's unreasonable to expect the building of a utopia or perfect society in this world. And so we have to deal with humanity as it is and not as we would wish it to be, which he thought is how the social gospel was skewed. Later, of course, emerging in the 1960s and coming to the fore in the 1970s, you have liberation theology, which in some ways was a more robust, radical version of the social gospel, aspiring not just to reform society, but in some cases to overthrow it, and maybe even to overthrow it violently. And so you had, obviously, it was popular in some Roman Catholic circles, especially in Latin America in the 1970s, especially working against some of the military dictatorships that then reigned in South America. It also became influential among the mainline Protestant denominations in the U.S., especially in their missions agencies and in their social witness agencies. All of the mainline Protestants, for example, have had for many decades, have today, and had then lobby offices on Capitol Hill. And liberation theology was very much the primary paradigm that governed their actions. And the trajectory through which it moved was, for example, in the 1960s, starting probably about 1965, the mainline Protestants, at least their official agencies, began coming out very strongly against U.S. participation in the Vietnam War. And that evolved by the late 1960s, the early 1970s, into outright support and affirmation for as a Christian imperative for the Viet Cong in Vietnam and for other Marxist revolutionary movements around the world. So it really was a radicalizing of the church's mission. Another important social witness tradition for Christians in America over the last 40 years has been what I would call the neo-Anabaptist tradition, beginning with John Howard Yoder, the Mennonite theologian who wrote a famous book, The Politics of Jesus. And he was Mennonite, obviously, but I think the twist of this tradition was that whereas old-style Anabaptists would live in a separatist form of way and would not themselves not participate in government, especially not in any kind of coercion or force, certainly not the military, but they would not question God's role for the state or even for the role of force. They would just say our communities will not participate. The new form of this neo-Anabaptist thought was much more adamant in declaring that faithful Christians who are truly followers of Jesus must reject all coercion and all force and not participate in, at least not the police and the military. And that remains a very influential school of thought. In the 1970s, somewhat related to the neo-Anabaptist school of thought, but not entirely, you had the rise of and really actually emerging before the religious right involving conservative evangelicals. You had progressive and liberal evangelicals forming an organized evangelical left. And so you had leaders who are still with us, although now moving into retirement, like Tony Campolo and Ron Sider. Of course, Ron Sider founded Evangelicals for Social Action 40 years ago. And there was also a manifesto that many of them organized in Chicago back 40 years ago. I believe it was called the Chicago Declaration, declaring that evangelicals must come out and address society directly and work for social justice as commanded by their faith. Of course, by the late 1970s, you had conservative evangelicals organizing their own response to changes in society, and the religious right involving notables like Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson and many others, some of whose names are now forgotten but were prominent in their day. And of course, most famously, Jerry Falwell helped to found the Moral Majority to organize social conservatives, especially to address social issues from a conservative perspective. And it was not, its primary base was conservative evangelical, but it was officially interfaith and tried to pull in Catholics and conservative Jews and Mormons and others in common collaboration. And the chief, I think it's fair to say, the chief philosophical guru for the founding of the religious right in those years was the sort of theologian, thinker, conservative Presbyterian Francis Schaeffer, who passed away in the 1980s. And many of you probably are not very familiar with him, if at all, but deeply influential, especially to people my age and maybe the generation before me. And essentially, Schaeffer just sort of melded together kind of a conventional Calvinist outlook on how to address society with American conservatism. And I think that his works sort of served as a mobilizing intellectual force to justify many evangelicals like Falwell and others who, I mean, they were engaged as citizens, they voted, but they were not organized in politics in an organized fashion, specifically as Christians and evangelicals. And so Schaeffer sort of paved the avenue for them to come in a very powerful way and to play a significant role, for example, in the election of Ronald Reagan in 1980. And so the decades of sort of semi-dormancy by conservative evangelicals and fundamentalists, who, at least according to the mythology, part of which is true, sort of went into hibernation after their defeat or their cultural and political defeat at the Scopes Monkey trial in the 1920s. I'll share a little bit of autobiographic information at this point, only as it relates to our overall theme, but I can remember very vividly as I must have been 18, 19 years old at the time, sort of been in the early 1980s, and becoming very interested in how the church and how Christians should address politics, and was interested in what Falwell and other conservatives were doing. So I wrote a personal check to, it must have been the Moral Majority, to get on their mailing list, got their magazine, which is called The Fundamentalist, and I think their gift for a new donor was Francis Schaeffer's Christian Manifesto. And so I read that, and I thought it was very compelling at that time as a young man. And I was not myself in a conservative church or an evangelical. I was in a sort of a very mainstream Methodist church in the suburbs of Washington, D.C., and it seemed like, to me at that time, that what conservative evangelicals and the religious right were offering was far more compelling and more robust in terms of what was happening to America and the world than what I was hearing in my own mainstream, maybe slightly liberal-leaning, medium-sized Methodist church, and certainly much more so than what the leaders of my denomination or what other mainline Protestants were doing and saying politically. And at about that time, and to give you a sort of a background of where mainline Protestants were at this time, and of course mainline is no longer mainline. Mainline is now old line. But historically, they were mainline, and they were the primary culture-shaping religious institutions of America for most of the last 400 years. But they suffered a huge implosion over the last 45 years. In fact, the year of my birth would have been the first year of, for example, my own Methodist denomination began its continuous membership decline the year of my birth, 1965. So for 49 years, it hasn't known a single year of membership growth in the United States. And that's true for almost all of the mainline churches. So if you take just the top 7 mainline denominations, typically called the Seven Sisters, the largest of which would be United Methodist, Evangelical Lutheran, Presbyterian Church USA, the Episcopal Church, the United Church of Christ, the Christian Church Disciples of Christ, and the American Baptists. 45 years ago, 1 out of every 6 Americans belonged to those 7 churches. Today, only 1 out of every 16 Americans belongs to those churches. That's just a huge demographic shift in American Christianity, which most people, even those who are very well informed about religion, don't give sufficient attention to, I don't think. So, for example, when I was a very small boy in a Sunday school in my Methodist church, it was filled with other children my own age who I went to school with that in the early 1970s. By the early 1980s, when I was a teenager, they were all gone, and my congregation was mostly people my grandparents' age, World War II generation people. And that was not just unique to my own congregation, that was a story of what was happening to mainline Protestantism around America. It lost a whole generation, 2 generations, maybe even 3 generations now of people who became non-churchgoers or filtered off into evangelical churches. Partly as a result of that demographic shift, Methodism, probably like other mainline churches, became very anxious to take very young, inexperienced people who probably had no business having church office and pushing them forward and giving them church office. So I was only 18, 19, 20 when they said, "You will be our delegate to Methodism's state convention for Virginia Methodism." And so I started going to those conventions, and once again was surprised by some of the political resolutions that were coming through, even this relatively conservative Virginia. Say, for example, Methodism opposing U.S. aid for helping the government of El Salvador oppose its Marxist insurrection, for example, or resolutions in solidarity with the Sandinista regime in Nicaragua, for example, or resolutions opposing the Reagan administration's defense buildup. And it seemed very odd to me that these were not issues that my relatively conservative congregation back home, that they were discussing in church, and yet they seemed to be a priority for the national and local leadership of my mainline church. Shortly afterwards, I became the chair of my local church's missions committee. I started reading up on the missions board of Methodism, which was one of the largest in America, and at that time had a $100 million budget, and became very surprised and concerned to find out that the missions board was dispersing grants to scores of controversial political organizations. So once again, groups in solidarity with the Sandinistas in Nicaragua, or the guerrillas in El Salvador, or even the Marxist guerrilla group that was in the Philippines at that point, or groups that were even in solidarity with the North Koreans, if you can believe it or not, and also grants to, at that time, Planned Parenthood, or a group called the Religious Coalition for Abortion Rights, which the Methodist Church had helped to found after the Roe v. Wade decision in 1973. And I was just scandalized by this discovery to think that this would be an object, this was actually the living out of Christian missions, and put together a report of what was happening with the missions board, which I shared with my congregation, and they were horrified, and we shared it with all the other Methodist churches in Northern Virginia, which led to the Bishop of Virginia organizing a delegation of us to go visit with our missions board executives up in New York City for a full day back in 1989. And I remember, again, I was a very young man at the time, in my early 20s, and was eager to confront them with, I thought, the injustice and the lack of integrity in their Christian social witness. And as we got into the nitty-gritty of what they were funding and what they were advocating, very vividly, I remember their treasurer explaining to us that, yes, they understood that most church members would disagree with their perspective on these political issues, but the same had been true in earlier decades when they had stood for civil rights, and from their perspective, most in the church had not. And so they thought they were on the side of social justice, and that for them this was a matter of a clear conscience, and they could not compromise, which in a way was a position of integrity, but in a way it was not, because it was not their money after all, or their names, but it was the church's name and the church's money that was being expended. And so I came away from that convinced that my own calling was to work for the reformation of the United Methodist Church, not realizing that would be a decades-long undertaking. I thought I could achieve that in 4 or 5 years. At the same time, or actually prior to that, the organization which I later joined as a staffer, and of which I'm now president, had been created in 1981 specifically to address these issues of Christian social witness in America. And again, it's the Cold War, and it's the late 1970s, and a young man who was an executive with the AFL-CIO trade union, and his office was serving as a liaison to overseas trade unions, and part of his work was to persuade them to remain pro-democratic and anti-Marxist. So he was himself a liberal Democrat, but very anti-communist, very pro-democracy. And so in 1978 or 79, when his children came home from their Methodist Sunday school raising money for the Methodist Missions Board, his very sensitive antenna went up, and he was suspicious by how they were describing their causes. Of course, eventually finding out what I would find out some years later, put together his own report and went to the governing convention of the Methodist Church in 1980 to persuade them, to expose to them what was going on with their missions board, and was not terribly persuasive in that format, but did meet others who shared his concerns. and came back to Washington, D.C., met with others throughout American Christianity who saw this as a crisis in terms of what America's churches, especially the mainline Protestants, were saying and doing in relation to democracy and human rights and the Cold War, and especially most egregiously, their silence about religious liberty and the fact that so many Christians and other people of faith and of conscience were being persecuted by oppressive totalitarian regimes, especially behind the Iron Curtain, and the church was not only mostly silent about that, but in some cases actually abetting, making apologies for some of those regimes and the proxies of some of those regimes. And so this labor union official, in collaboration with Methodist evangelists from Texas, pulled together some Catholic intellectuals like Michael Novak, eventually, a little bit later, George Weigel. They pulled in Richard Newhouse, who was later Catholic, but at that point a Lutheran pastor and thinker. They pulled in Carl Henry, the great evangelical theologian who was the founding editor of Christianity Today magazine, and some other thinkers, and they founded the Institute on Religion and Democracy, whose founding document was called Christianity and Democracy, written by Father Newhouse, who makes the case that, of course, the church itself is not primarily a political instrument, but nonetheless, when it does speak politically, of course, it should speak out on behalf of human dignity and human rights for all, and democracy, and especially religious freedom for all. And so those were our guiding principles, and the targets of the IRD at that time were the social witness to the mainline churches and ecumenical bodies like the National Council of Churches and the World Council of Churches, and they created lots of media firestorms. So, for example, Reader's Digest did a famous story that it was essentially an expose of the National Council of Churches and the World Council of Churches back in the early 1980s. Reader's Digest magazine, which probably none of you have ever seen or maybe even heard of, but if you ask your grandparents, they will tell you back in the day Reader's Digest was read by millions of people, and Reader's Digest did several exposés of those ecumenical agencies. And I think it's safe to say that ever since then, 30 years ago, those ecumenical agencies never quite recovered the respect and the prestige that they had, especially back in the 1940s and the 1950s, where the National Council of Churches had really been seen as the spokesman for mainstream American Protestantism in America. Well, my organization, when the Cold War ended in the early 1990s, began to address what the churches were doing and saying on some domestic policy issues, but just as perhaps even more importantly, even what the churches were doing and arguing about in terms of their own theology, especially the sexuality issues, which had become the main battle flag issues between conservatives and liberals in all of the mainline churches, starting in the 1970s and running up through today. So the Episcopalians, the Lutherans, the Presbyterians, and the Methodists. And so the IRD worked with the Orthodox, more conservative side in all of those churches, striving to help defend the church's traditional teachings on marriage and ordination and sexual ethics. And of course, as many of you already know the history, the conservatives lost those battles, and so far 5 of the 7 mainline Protestant churches, only the American Baptists and of course the United Methodists have retained their official Orthodox teachings on ordination and marriage and sexuality. And as a result, the organized conservative forces and Orthodox forces in most of those mainline denominations have essentially given up the battle. Some of them have just sort of gone dormant. Others have created new denominations, a new Anglican denomination, new Lutheran denomination, new Presbyterian denomination, and we continue to work with them. But I think more significantly, our work has shifted to a wider sphere in that the evangelical world, as the old religious right passes from the scene, there are, of course, new forces and a new generation among evangelicals, no longer sort of attached in remembering the history of what created the old religious right. And we are concerned, in some cases, they're following the same path and replicating the same mistakes that took the mainline Protestant world from the main line to the sideline in terms of, perhaps unconsciously, but replacing the core mission of the church with a political mission that often seems to resemble more the social gospel than the traditional gospel, and often following the mainline Protestant pattern in social witness of rather than trying to speak for the consensus of the church's teachings and the consensus of the church's members, but rather, quote unquote, trying to be prophetic and getting way out front of the constituency, and therefore losing the trust of the constituency, but also losing the interest of the policymakers and the influence shapers of culture, whom they're trying to, whose policies, of course, they're trying to affect. So we're trying to sound the alarm of those trends going on among evangelicals. One important issue for Christian social witness, one more word regarding the National Council of Churches, which is very reflective of what happened to the mainline Protestant world. If you were to go back to 1959, when the Rockefellers built a large building on Riverside Drive and on the Upper West Side of New York to be the headquarters of mainline Protestantism in America. The National Council of Churches is going to be there, and the agencies of Methodism and Presbyterianism and Lutheranism, all to be in that one sort of temple across from Riverside Church and Union Seminary, and President Eisenhower was there, and this would really sort of emblemize where mainline Protestantism was in America at that point. And the National Council of Churches would have at its height hundreds of employees and a budget in today's dollars of many tens of millions. Well, today, in 2013, the National Council of Churches, 2014, but last year actually left its headquarters in New York and is now down to, as on its staff roster, only 5 employees, and moved into sort of a small space in the Methodist building on Capitol Hill, and now has a budget of only $1.4 million. It's hard to believe that was once the voice of a mainstream Protestantism in America, but that really should be a warning to others, evangelicals and Protestants who might be tempted to follow that same path in terms of social witness example. One issue today for Christian social witness, beyond what I've already mentioned, is the collapse of denominational loyalties and of authoritative religious institutions. So when I was a boy, we were all Methodist or Presbyterian or Lutheran or Catholic. All of us had some very clear denominational heritage or loyalty. I suspect that's very rare for many of you in this audience, and certainly polls confirm that tens of millions of American Christians no longer have strong loyalties to any particular denominational structure or even any particular denominational heritage, and they're just sort of broadly Christian or evangelical, or they have other terms to describe where they are spiritually. And as a consequence, and there's nothing necessarily intrinsically bad about that, but it is a very different situation from where America has typically been. And so America, in many ways, despite all of the rhetoric about the rise of the religious nuns and the religious unaffiliated, and ostensibly we're far more secular than we used to be, and there's some truth to that, but in terms of how many Americans, say, go to church regularly, that's been remarkably stable for the last 80 years. About 40% will tell pollsters that they go to church with some regularity. That was true in the 1930s, and that's true today. But the people who are going to church, once again, they're not tied to any firm, authoritative denominational structures, leaving them, in effect, sort of floating free agents in many regards. And so to shape Christian social witness today, which in past years and decades was a matter of going to church conventions or persuading church agency chiefs or persuading a few major Christian thinkers who had influence in particular churches when things were much more centralized, that's no longer the case. And of course, today's largest religious demographic is no longer, as I mentioned, mainline Protestant, but it's now generically evangelical. And whereas Episcopalians or Lutherans or Presbyterians or Methodists all had sort of a tradition of a particular form of social witness dating back across centuries, evangelical is not really a tradition. It's just sort of a modern American political movement. And so there's not really a tradition there, which leaves many evangelicals just sort of open to whatever trend or fad may be coming across the scene, whether it's conservative or liberal or something in between. There's also the issue today that many religious Americans are privatizing their faith, and they're focusing on their own spirituality while they're ignoring its public and civic implications. Some are withdrawing from political engagement because of despair over the wider political culture, which is understandable, and many others, again untethered to the traditional teachings of their faith, succumb far more easily to emotive political appeals wherever they're coming from. So it's much more challenging now, as I said, to develop a cohesive Christian social witness. However, realizing that not all Christians are necessarily called to politics, there still needs to be a collective social witness for those who are called. And so I offer up a few possible principles, especially for evangelicals, but not exclusively for evangelicals, that perhaps could be helpful as we look towards the future. Number one would be emphasizing an Augustinian understanding of the limitations of fallen humanity by nature. And of course, Calvinists are especially good at warning us about the depravity of humanity, and we should heed their teachings. But also, as I said, Reinhold Niebuhr had that same emphasis in terms of warning against the idea that we can create the perfect society composed of the perfect people. Inevitably, those kinds of projects end up disastrously. Another point I would offer up for consideration is to emphasize a confidence in providence and in the Holy Spirit's power to redeem not just individuals, but also whole communities and nations. And as a Methodist, I would especially cite there the Wesleyan example of perseverance in social reform. So the Methodists, dating back to the 1700s, had the same view of human nature as the Calvinists did, total depravity, as John Wesley specifically used that term, dating to Calvin, but nonetheless had an optimism, or at least a hope, that God was active in the world and could create great things despite human nature if people would heed the influence of the Holy Spirit. Obviously, many examples of that, the abolition movement being just one of the more exceptional of them. Another principle I would put forward would be the centrality of God's Word for guidance, which I think Baptists can especially teach us much about. And that entails prioritizing issues to which Scriptures speak most directly and being more modest on the other issues where there isn't direct scriptural guidance, and allowing room for prudential judgment on those issues. We shouldn't pretend that the Bible gives us direct guidance on dozens and dozens, much less hundreds of political issues, when emphatically it does not, and people of sound faith and goodwill can often disagree on those issues. I would offer up or suggest and commend some acknowledgement of traditional Lutheran teaching about God working through the so-called two kingdoms, kingdom of man, kingdom of God, and being careful not to confuse the two. Another point I would offer up would be appreciating the church's universality and avoiding the temptation of strictly private judgment, which is especially a temptation for us who are Americans, especially for Protestants, especially for evangelicals, to imagine that we are our own authority and we can dissent from what have been the historic teachings of universal Christianity. Those teachings are there for as a means of grace and are important tools for us to rely on, and we should not shun them. And of course, the Catholic stance, traditional Roman Catholic stance about the hierarchy of teachings, plus their understanding of subsidiarity, plus their understanding of natural law, should all be especially important. Many of us who are Protestant and evangelical don't often have those teachings embedded in our own understanding, and certainly can benefit from them. Another point I would put forward for consideration is some level of emotional detachment from political theology. And the comment I have in mind regarding that issue would be our IRD founder and the Catholic thinker-philosopher Michael Novak, in his new memoir, notes that the Episcopalians have had so many more American presidents than the Baptists have, and he thinks the Episcopalians are just better traditionally at doing politics because they're more reserved and detached, whereas the Baptists are very excitable and impassioned, and issues become much more a matter of hell versus heaven, and there can be no compromise. And I think Novak has somewhat of a good understanding there, and we need to understand that not every issue needs to be apocalyptic. Finally, I would offer up what I would call a Lincoln-esque understanding for appreciating how providence works mysteriously through many actors on different sides of the same issue. So we shouldn't necessarily assume that all of God's people who are faithfully and sincerely following his will necessarily will agree on a particular issue and will be aligned against people who are uniformly against God's will. It's far more complex, and often Providence has a special calling and role for people on all sides of a particular issue. And also as a part of that, we should maybe commend the utility of civil religion in mediating diverse religious and political perspectives. And once again, that plugs into the mainline Protestant legacy in America. And I think it was one of the great gifts of the mainline Protestants in creating this sort of Protestant suffused civil religion that didn't equate Christian faith with political specifics, but it did provide language and traditions for faith to operate within and inclusively to influence American democracy. Of course, the main line is now almost gone, or it's sidelined, and the question before us is who will pick up the torch for a constructive, redemptive Christian social witness now and in the future years. And of course, this answer is known unto Providence, but I think the answer likely includes most of us here in this room as we strive to create that new social witness to shape our nation and our culture and to lead our churches. So I will end on that note, almost exactly on time. And if you all have any questions or comments, I would be happy to receive them. I understand some of you are getting extra credit from your classes to be here, so the extra credit is well deserved, I think. Yes?
Can you talk about the religion of the different political candidates and why religion has become such a big topic as far as like the media gets into it and rips people apart about who they may have heard in the past, or what, how is all that tying into the future of politics? This whole,
in terms of the religious faith of candidates?
even the denomination of the candidates.
Well, that's not entirely new. I mean, there have always been controversies involving political candidates, dating back to Jefferson running against John Adams. So perhaps it was arguably intensified in the 1970s with the rise of evangelicals and their involvement in politics. And certainly those of us who can recall Jimmy Carter's first campaign, and it was very perplexing to a lot of people for a presidential candidate to openly be describing himself as born again, and to describe that experience. And I think that brought a much greater limelight that focused on the political faith of candidates. So in that particular year, for example, 1976, even the reserve Gerald Ford felt compelled to say that he was born again too as an Episcopalian, and that, which seems no doubt sincere, but I doubt that he typically spoke in that kind of language. But it seems like ever since the mid-1970s, there's been much more expectation for candidates, especially at the presidential level, to share their personal faith in ways that maybe were not common in previous decades. Whereas previously, perhaps presidents, they would pay homage to civil religion, they would go to church, they would cite God. You have the example of President Eisenhower feeling obliged to join the Presbyterian Church after he was elected, but not sharing a lot of personal emotion about how he came to his decisions of faith. So maybe we can blame evangelicals for creating that environment of candidates falling under that compulsion to describe their faith. Yes, sir.
When you speak of the centrality of God's Word, and it should apply to more major issues rather than minor issues, are you saying that those major, would you describe what those major issues might be and where they revolve around, say, poverty and money and social justice? Or?
Well, there's going to be a disagreement over what those major issues are, but if you look at the social witness emphasis of the Catholic bishops, for example, of the last several years, they've been emphasizing defense of marriage and sanctity of life and religious liberty as being the priorities. And I think there are strong arguments to be made that historic Christianity has clear teachings on the definition of marriage and particular teaching about humanity and dignity of all persons, including the unborn and the terminally ill and so forth. And I think by implication has teachings pointing towards an affirmation of religious liberty. So I think those are laudable emphases. Whereas other issues may be very, very important, and Christians should be involved, but it would be difficult to make an argument in your local community that a particular park should be constructed in that neighborhood versus this neighborhood, or you should spend money in a public library next year versus 5 years from now. Or in terms of national issues, some would make the argument that being a very zealous environmentalist is pro-life and it's a Christian imperative, and there are arguments for Christians making environmental arguments, but I think it's really sort of a straining credulity to say that the scriptures have a very clear command about what U.S. Environmental law or regulation should be in the year 2014. Countless other issues. What should tax rates be for the United States? It would be absurd to claim that there's a Christian view on what the tax rates should be for our particular nation at this time in history. It's a prudential judgment that we can have a common faith but disagree about. Anybody else? Yes.
You mentioned something about having confidence in the Holy Spirit to hold our nation as a unit. One of my biggest fears is that a lot of us will, if a Christian or many Christians get involved in politics, they become either so anti-conservative or so anti-liberal that they kind of miss the point. And what are your thoughts on as far as trying to maintain a certain balance in Christianity and being able to accept everyone as a whole, but yet not being so anti-other political party? I know it's pretty broad, but
Yeah, that's a good point. Again, different vocations for different people and different vocations for the institutional church versus individual believers. So I would hope that the institutional church and its clergy and its offices would avoid the temptation to try to align the church with one particular faction, saying this is God's will and the other factions are against God's will. To speak more broadly that we're the instrument of God's grace, offering His grace to all people. And here are our teachings. We don't make firm decisions whether or not you're where you stand with God. But I would make an argument in favor of individuals or people of faith operating corporately, but not claiming they speak for the church, to be partisan. I think if you're going to have a functioning democracy, you have to have robust and active and often outspoken political parties. And for those parties to be successful, they need to have people who are enthusiastic about them and out there making the arguments and serving them faithfully. So I'm not prepared to say Christians should never be partisan. I think some people are called to be partisan, but I don't think the church as a body is called to be partisan. And ideally, the church would include partisans from different factions who nonetheless can worship together and serve the same God. So I hope I've answered your question. But it's often, to me, irritating to hear these blanket commands. Christians must do this politically, or Christians must do that. Christians must jump into politics. Christians must step back from politics, as though all 2 billion of us in the world have the exact same vocation in terms of how we live out our faith. Obviously, God has unique plans for each one of us as individuals, and some of you are called to be active in politics, and many of you are not called, and most of us are somewhere in between, so we need to respect that. Anybody else?
Tied to his question, could you expand on this idea of redeeming a nation a little further and possibly biblical foundation for that?
Well, that's complicated, and I'm sorry you asked me that question. I'm not sure I'm prepared to answer. I threw that out as a bullet point, and it merits somebody writing a book. I'm trying to encourage the rediscovery of the doctrine of providence, which I think very few Christians talk about anymore. You almost have to unearth the 19th century authors to get into that doctrine. But St. Augustine has a wonderful quote, which I can't remember word for word off the top of my head, but it goes along the lines that it's absurd to think that God calls individuals and has a will for them, but that He doesn't also have a will or a calling for nations and for rulers. So all things on this earth ultimately are under His lordship, and so we have to assume He has plans for not just us as individual people or our families or our churches, but also for the wider community, and that would include the nation. So that believing that God has a plan for your nation doesn't necessarily equate with having an idolatrous regard for your nation, or to think that God uniquely loves your nation above others. It just means He has a role for it. Anybody else with a provocative question?
I don't know if it's provocative or not, but so if Augustine was correct, and you're saying that the Methodist Church was on the wrong side of providence, possibly in the 80s and 90s, are you applying your principles or helping Methodism out today at all? Are you talking to them about reforming the church? I know you were very involved
I am, but I think there's only one other Methodist in the room, so I wasn't going to spend a whole lot of time talking about that. But speaking directly to him, and maybe some of the rest of you are interested, but as I mentioned, it's the one mainline Protestant denomination in America that hasn't compromised its sexuality teachings, which means the conservative and the evangelical side in the church, unlike in the others, is still very much in a battle with the more liberal side of the church. And it's still the largest mainline church. It's the third largest in America, although it's declined from it was 11 million at its height in the late 1960s. It's down to 7.3 million today in the U.S. But the big news about Methodism is it's almost uniquely, I can't find any other examples of this among exactly U.S. denominations, but its membership is directly global, and its governing body is global. So there are now almost 5 million members of the church in Africa. So the total membership of the denomination is 12.5 million. And the African membership is growing over 200,000 members a year. The U.S. membership is declining by 100,000. So the Africans will become a majority in less than 10 years. And the Africans vote uniformly on the conservative side or the Orthodox side on theological and sexuality issues. So when the denomination had its convention in 2012, voting on the church's stance on marriage and homosexual behavior, it affirmed the traditional stance by 61%. But 40% of the delegates were from outside the U.S. So if they had not been there, Methodism would be where the Episcopal Church and the other mainline churches are today. So evangelicals in the U.S. Methodist Church are working with the African churches for what they hope will be a new future for the church, and hopefully the 45-year decline of U.S. Methodism will reverse as the growing African churches become more involved in the governance of the U.S. church. But and you may have read some of the headlines that the more liberal side of the church, in frustration over its inability to win legislatively, has been practicing what they call ecclesial disobedience by having same-sex unions in Methodist churches. So you had a Methodist minister defrocked a couple months ago outside Philadelphia. You have another Methodist minister who actually is a former dean of Yale Divinity School facing a church trial in New York. Another half dozen similar cases of that you'll be reading about if you read the religion page of your local newspaper. Anybody else? Yes?
You mentioned that denominations are losing their authority as legitimate religious structures. What would you say are replacing denominations as structures of legitimate authority, religious authority?
Well, I have no answer to offer that. I don't know what the options will be. Ross Douthat, the New York Times columnist, who's relatively conservative Catholic, his new book, Bad Religion, its chief theme is the deconstruction of religious institutions in America and the resulting unmooring of American Christians, social witness being just one example of that. So what will replace the once preeminent mainline church agencies or even the more conservative denominations as their ecclesial structures likely continue to recede? I don't know. I mean, right now we're sort of we've moved into a world of parachurch groups and mega churches and lots of entrepreneurial activity among evangelicals founding new ministries, which is wonderful, but it's more and more decentralized. And on the one hand, it offers more vitality and more adaptability to a changing culture, but on the other hand, it's more difficult to sort of mobilize behind common themes. I guess you have to have trust in the Holy Spirit if you wish to achieve something, that he will mobilize these disparate forces, but that takes a lot of faith. That's the only answer I can offer right now. Our Richard Newhouse, one of our IRD founders, wrote a book 20 years ago. One of his common themes was after he became Catholic in the early 1990s, he thought with the collapse of the old Protestant structures, perhaps the Catholic Church was attaining a sort of a unique moment where it could offer the leadership to American society and culture that the mainline Protestants once had. My impression was by the time he died 4 years ago, he had that hope had been somewhat disappointed. His successor and protege, Jody Bottom, has a new book out just now on what who is himself Catholic, on what the decline of the mainline Protestants means for American culture, and he sort of laments the sadness. They offered this leadership and spiritual counsel, cultural counsel for close to 400 years, and they're gone, and there's this void, and there's really no one who's equipped to fill that void. So I think his book is kind of a lament without offering any clear solution. Yes.
Could you speak to kind of what you see you're speaking of political witness. What do you see the end goal of political witness? Or government laws to adopt the view of churches, for the view of churches to be heard? What do you see as the end goal of an effective political witness?
Well, an effective and faithful witness for Christians, not just for churches, but for individuals, would be to exemplify the grace of God and the love of God in terms of advocating dignity and protection for all people, and to work for a more just and humane society to the extent that is possible. So that would be my succinct definition for you. Yes?
Looking ahead over, we'll say, the next decade, or however far you might take it, what do you anticipate being sort of the cutting-edge issues for a Christian political witness? You sort of mentioned how for the last 20 years or so it's revolved around issues of sexuality primarily. Do you see that trend continuing, or are those battles sort of subsiding, something new coming to take the place?
Well, unfortunately, I don't see those battles subsiding. I think there's a lot of hope that maybe if, for example, if our own nation ultimately just sort of reconcile the same-sex marriage and the debate ends, I think it'll just be beginning. You could probably have new debates about even wider definitions of marriage. So the Utah court case about polygamy, for example, recently, that's a sort of a new avenue that we'll be heading into. But just once again, the court's ruling 40 years ago on abortion, when it was widely perceived that had settled the issue, and here's one of the hottest hot buttons still with us 40 years later. It seems very likely that for the rest of our lives, we probably will be addressing issues of abortion and the definition of marriage. I don't see how we're going to escape from that. I don't. In terms of other issues, obviously religious liberty is very important. It's going to become more important. I would have a concern that the culture continues on its current course. A lot of conservative evangelicals and other conservative people of faith will become more despairing or dismissive about the culture in the nation and use that to justify their own withdrawal from politics and attempts to shape the culture, which I think is kind of an escape from responsibility. So that could be a real danger. I've only briefly alluded to issues of pacifism and just war. It could be a possibility that conservative religious people in America have always been perceived as being very pro-military, very pro-national security. It's possible if the culture continues on its current course, and if a large number of those conservative people see the nation as decadent and perhaps no longer meriting defense, they could become much more ambivalent about national security and the military. I hope we don't get to that situation, but I see that as a possibility. Yes?
It seems to me in the kind of emails I get and from national organizations that instead of like the Methodist Church having a list of things that they support, now Christians are being drawn to one organization that deals with one topic.
Mm-hmm.
Or multiple conservative organizations that deal with one topic. And so, I feel hopeful for that. So instead of just the Methodist Church carrying the banner, you have these, organizations like that you have all these Christians who are reading, millions of people are reading these emails and are supporting sending money for these lobbyists to go to D.C. And so that seems hopeful. It may look like the church is not stepping up, but like you said, it's the individual Christians who are supporting the first. So we still have the power. The power's still working.
That's an excellent point. I hadn't thought of that, but I think you're right in your analysis of that trend. I sometimes like to point out that the mainline denominations, for example, have this history of going back decades of addressing just dozens of political issues every year, which they don't have the expertise for. So if you contrast them with, say, the Catholics, it's a billion-member church that's global with hundreds of universities and colleges and thousands of ministries. They have an expertise that gives them the knowledge base to intelligently address many, many issues at one time. And I think most Protestant denominations that are tend to be national churches, just a fraction of that size, don't have anywhere near that expertise. So in some ways it might be helpful if Protestant denominations, evangelical denominations, if they were to focus or zero in on one or two particular issues for which they have a special calling and special expertise, that might be constructive. The same is true for parachurch groups. But one historical example comes to mind is whenever you think about prohibition, that really is how the Methodists came into political activism in the 20th century. That was their issue, and they were tremendously successful in that, at least up until 1933. And that's really all they did and said politically, with addressing related issues of drugs and gambling and prostitution, but that was it. And it was only later in the 30s and 40s that they morphed into this sort of wider engagement of addressing many, many issues. And the Methodist Book of Governance, for example, up to the 50s and 60s, only had 4 or 5 or 6 political statements that were passed at the preceding governing convention that were printed in that book. As of today, they have a separate book called the Book of Resolutions that's 1,000 pages long, hundreds of resolutions that nobody's ever going to read, for which the church is completely lacking in expertise. So that's the wrong way, I think, to do political witness. And evangelicals can learn from that. So, for example, the National Association of Evangelicals, when they put together their new document on social witness, that was accompanied by a book, and my predecessor, who was then IRD president, Diane Nippers, actually played a role in putting that book together. And there's nothing there in the book or in the statement that I think most of us would disagree with, but it's a lot of stuff. And I remember Richard Newhouse in his magazine First Things at the time commenting that if you read the statement that evangelicals are called to do this and 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 this, he really questioned, when will evangelicals ever have time to sleep if there's this urgent command to engage all these issues simultaneously all the time. So once again, the Catholic understanding of a hierarchy of issues, I think, would be helpful to a lot of evangelicals.
Where do you place the authority of the Scriptures in one's definition of political witness?
Well, it's the definitive authority for the Christian church, obviously, but as I mentioned, we have to really be modest in terms of making political claims about the Bible as we try to apply it to the specifics of today. So I guess modesty is a chief theme that we should have in mind when we claim that the Bible has called us to address a particular political issue. Yes?
You talked about the possible movement to withdraw from the political culture, and I was wondering if you think what we're seeing now is similar, like we've seen this before and it's cyclical. So, for example, you mentioned the Scopes monkey trial. You have, H.L. Mencken reporting during that time, and he could outsnark any blogger, living today, obviously, what he's doing there, to where anyone who was against him was a knuckle-dragging, Neanderthal, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
But now, people are talking about especially in public discourse, where, for example, on the issue of marriage, right, to be for the church's traditional teaching on marriage is prima facie evidence that you are a hateful bigot or something like that. So, we saw the same kind of thing going on maybe in the 20s when the Scopes monkey trial was going on. Do you think it's different now because you have national political leaders who are saying that rather than journalists back then, and so people could dismiss it? Or is it, so is this, is it a far worse situation, or do you think it's just kind of this cyclical process of that?
Well, I don't want to say it's worse. It's, I think, a vanity to think that our own times are always the worst. Typically, their past times have been even worse, and there's no other time in human history where I would rather live than right now. I would not want to be alive in 1920 or 1820 or 1720. Maybe it's comparable to the 1920s in that the cultural defeat of fundamentalism sort of forced them into a subculture where they created their own new alternative institutions, schools, and ministries, and so forth, that really sort of formed the seed base of the rise of conservative religious activism in the 1970s, 50 years later. So I guess if you wanted to be really a long-term visionary for conservative evangelical activism today, you could say, well, even if we lose all the cultural issues, we'll just follow that pattern and sort of go to ground and create a new subculture, and we'll come back 40 or 50 years from now. I would think that evangelicals today, for all of our challenges, have more, not that we should get carried away with it in our confidence or egotism, but we have more influence now than fundamentalists had in the 1920s. So back in the 1920s, the fundamentalists had to almost completely start from scratch. And the liberal, mainline, modernist Protestant world was completely dominated, had all the major academies, campuses, publishing houses. And it's amazing to think all those institutions are now almost irrelevant in the mainline Protestant world, and that those sort of new organs of the subculture displace them. So all of the largest seminaries in America now are all evangelical or conservative Protestant. So I think we just have to remember God always has surprises, and we shouldn't assume that the current spiral in any arena of human activity is going to continue on indefinitely. Anybody else? Yes.
My name is Lloyd. I'm from Jasper County, Jasper, Texas. We don't really deal with the issue of, I guess, abortion and the issue of marriage per se. Very conservative, evangelical county, 30 minutes from Louisiana, but we do have issues with, I say, poverty, as far as lack of job, lack of industry. It's more of a rural farming community, and also there's issues of race. James Byrd Jr. was the man who was dragged there in '98. 2005, we had another incident similar, and in November, lost another friend and a close family member in the Methodist faith as well, due to a racial tension death. It's hard for some of my peers who are pursuing social or political careers to separate faith from the political atmosphere. And I'm just asking what kind of encouragement would you have for I and others who are having to not necessarily address issues of abortion or issues of marriage, but issues of lack of industry, and issues of racial crimes that are not being sought out or fully cleared properly. What kind of advice would you have for those of us who are in those counties, who are trying to walk that balance between political and the church response?
Are you a pastor or a lay
I'm
person?
a minister and a social worker.
And, do you pastor a church, or are you full-time?
I'm not a full-time pastor. I just assist the church. I'm just wondering what your take is on that, even though you're not in a rural area yourself, but
right.
seeing that is some of the issues that exist.
Well, off the top of my head, I would counsel maybe to avoid the temptation of trying to use your congregation or your church for a specific political program, but to try to find kindred spirits throughout your community who share your same concerns.
Look at it more from a social gospel aspect, other than political. Is that what you're saying?
Just to find other kindred spirits in other churches who have the same passions that you have about what the community needs, and create your new network. It may be political, it may be just ministry, could be just charitable, it could be all of those things. But you need to find another half dozen people who want to work with you if you're going to be effective. And don't limit yourself to your own congregation.
Of course.
Find them elsewhere.
Appreciate that.
You know. I think that was the last
All right.
question.
Well, this has been terrific and a great discussion, so thank you very much.
Thank you.
Join me again in thanking Mark Tooley.